So now we're recording. Hey. Okay, so I want to share screen. Okay, so here my, I thought I had a set of notes for this. I had to create these this morning. So I'll just kind of run through this. Largely follows the pattern of the article. The article kind of begins, its beginning point was, in large part, was my dissertation. I have a whole chapter on Peter Ramus. But I really don't talk too much about what was in my dissertation. My co-writer, who's a friend, Doug McKnight, he's also an LSU PhD with me. And at the beginning for him, he actually has I guess it's his dissertation, his dissertation, which was published. Mine was published as well, which is basically on the Puritans. And I guess the thesis of that book is what would be considered Puritan educational values would evolve at the end of the 19th century into middle-class education values. And so, part of one of the arguments of the paper is the article is that American curriculum, particularly, and I think some degree, and I haven't studied it closely, but my guess is Canadian as well, has its origins in the Puritan universities and Puritan ways of thinking and ways of educating. So there are a number of things that kind of went into this article. And this is actually one of two. The other article you read, The Puritan Origins of Technology, was part of this paper in form. The editor suggested we separate them, as editors have to do. And really the Puritan paper took on a little different tact. So it's not a direct historical continuation, but it is indirectly. What was new in that paper is the technological origins or origins of technological thinking. So as a prelude to, I briefly mention Ralph Tyler. Ralph Tyler's Principles of Curriculum and Instruction, which he wrote, which was published in 1949, is still to a great extent. He had 4 principles coming out of that I can't remember. I didn't include them in the paper. That still, by and large, or the structure of the way curriculum is developed and organized. The difference between Tyler's day and today is clearly the test. But you can see in Tyler's, you could see in some degree in the way, the pattern of Tyler's book in the principles that we would inevitably come to a test. I would argue, but he also comes out of an area of study which was the development of psychometrics, And so the psychological testing movement coming out of the Midwest really in the earlier part of the 20th century. So let's say 20 years, 25 years prior to the publishing of the book. So testing, psychological testing, so the testing in general is very much part of the curriculum tradition. And particularly and Klebart and the struggles for American curriculum. We'll get into that a little bit. And he said Tyler's name should reappear. So the article is really about Peter Ramus. Peter Ramus is a arts master, 16th century arts master. He dies, or one could say he's murdered, in 1572 during the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. I've mentioned that. And, basically, not because he was a Protestant, we're not really sure how Protestant he might have been. He certainly hung out with Protestants. Most of the book publishers from the Rhineland were Protestants. But he dedicates all of his books to a Cardinal Archbishop of Paris. And he has the protection, interestingly, he was murdered, even though he had the protection of the king, and was a royal professor at the University of Paris. Interestingly, he was a royal professor of mathematics, so which is not his original area. He did some study, but and Ramus is understood to be part of the reform movement coming out of the Renaissance. So you have these Renaissance humanist reformers. They're trying to reform schools, the universities. Another somewhat famous reformer would be St. Thomas More. There are numerous others. We talk about Agricola would have been one of those. So, and really these reforms are precipitated by the Northern Renaissance movement, which is not the same as the Italian, but certainly influenced a great deal by the Italian movement. Agricola being Italian, but he traveled across the Alps and began influencing the liberal arts programs north of the Alps. The seven liberal arts, which were sort of coalesced in the 11th century, the trivium, the art of Latin grammar, Latin rhetoric, and Latin dialectic. And basically, this was how a student was trained in Latin. Although what's interesting as you read, what you realize is while a child would have been brought to a monastery school or a cathedral school at the age of 7 or 8, which we understand as the age of reason, they really don't begin attending formal classes maybe until 9 or 10, and depending on how bright they are, and this is dependent upon how well they learn their basic Latin through prayer and chant and general dialogue, because the cathedral school or the monastery, you would have had monks and students from all over different parts of Western Europe. So the language of the monastery would have been Latin. And so the basic understanding of the language, these students would have learned orally, through oral discourse, which is really not unlike the way young children learn their native languages. these kids, these young students would have had probably a basic grasp of reading and writing in their own vernacular, probably taught at home, maybe at a village school, just depends. The quadrivium, so once you finished the trivium, you received your bachelor's, and you were required by law, once you received your bachelor's, to teach the trivium. You would have taught Latin grammar or Latin rhetoric. The brighter ones and older ones would have taught dialectic. Ramus was known for his Latin ability. So he was considered one of the foremost Latin rhetoricians of his day. But he was kind of a revolutionary scholar. He attacked Aristotle and tried to revise Aristotle. And for that, that's probably one of the reasons he was murdered. The traditional professors didn't like that so much. So when you finished the trivium, you would begin the quadrivium, and of course you did studies in these four areas: music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And so the only way you could study that is if you knew Latin, because all learning was done in Latin. It may surprise you to see music as an academic activity, but this holds over from the Greeks. Music is seen as a bridge course, if you will, particularly for younger students in the Greek period, because it incorporated both physical activity as well as mental activity. So your dance would be part of this. But it's also seen as a prelude to both arithmetic and geometry, because you're understanding arithmetic calculations on the way in which music is organized. So, and then you move on to arithmetic, geometry, and finally astronomy, which is basically a general science. But they were, clearly you needed arithmetic and geometry to study the stars and to study planets, to study the heavens. So you see how all this sort of works together, moves you to that final course. There were three other arts. So once you became an arts master, which was generally seen for most as a terminal degree, and so when you graduated from the quadrivium, you received your arts master, and then so you taught the quadrivium, and you might have continued to teach the trivium as Ramus did. But you could go on to law. You could go on to medicine, and you could go on to what is considered the queen of the sciences, which was theology. Many people began theology, very few people ever finished. It would take a very long time. Most arts masters that wanted to go on would go into medicine, because if you became a medical doctor, you were allowed to get married. So think about, in this day, if you became an arts master, there's my phone, it's a junk call, then you were a bachelor, you remained a bachelor, you were a cleric of some type, you went through the church in some form or another. You may not have been a priest, but you were considered, you received some holy orders of some type. Sorry about that. So somebody's marketing health insurance to me. Um, so what you see, you, so what you see at this point with Ramus and the Renaissance reformers, you see the beginning of the move away from the liberal arts into the humanities, which we understand today as the humanities. And Ramus's reforms of the art of dialectic were part of that process. Okay. Also, in this period, in the Middle Ages, you went to school to be a teacher. So a university is a corporation of teachers, just like a guild. Any of the trades guilds is a corporation of butcher, baker, or candlestick maker, etc. So, so you were destined to teach if you went to university. So in this period, in the end of the 15th century and into the 16th, or the end of the 16th, I'm sorry, the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, you begin to see with the rise of more modern types of business, particularly in places like Germany, but also to some degree, in France and England, you began to see a move where schooling became a place to learn how to live one's life better as you worked in business, as you had a rising, maybe bourgeois or middle class through this period. It's often referred, tied to what is called the Protestant work ethic. But as you'll read in the Puritan paper, the Puritans are really not part of the Protestant work ethic, despite what Weber may have written about. So any questions at this point?
Could you explain the difference between the liberal arts and the humanities a little bit more?
Well, the liberal arts you had the 7 liberal arts, and that was the school, the schooling tradition, beginning with the rise of Western education with Alcuin of York during Charlemagne's reign, which would, Alcuin of York convinced Charlemagne you needed to have a literate, bureaucracy. And so what better group than clerics, monks, and so that's how Western education sort of reignites itself after the Dark Ages. There's a little more to it, but that's the basics. So the liberal arts doesn't change a whole lot. It does. We do finally lose music somewhere in the 14th or 15th century. Some schools may have added philosophy at that point. Geometry may have been broken up into plane geography and solid geography and different little things. The humanities begins to reemerge really in the 16th century, not reemerge, but emerge in the 16th century with the rise of modern subjects. So you might have had history, geography, for instance. We still don't necessarily have English per se. That comes about a little later. You begin to see modern notions of sciences. So rather than amorphous generalized science, you might get some physics and astronomy and biology to begin to emerge. So that's the fundamental difference. And with humanities, you have the rise of the modern university. So it looks, you begin to look different to some degree. And the American university model is largely based upon the German model, and the idea of the seminar, the idea of courses that would lead to a degree per se, was more of a German model that arose. And because even today in the English model, I mean, they're courses, but they don't necessarily, you don't take courses to lead to a completion. You take courses in order to take a test, or do some sort of capstone exercise. And so there's a kind of, you don't really have to go to classes, but we require everybody to go to classes. So that's a shorthand, Eric, explanation. But it's really the rise of modern subjects. Ramus develops what he calls the dialectic of the arts, which is really a process. So you can think of the liberal arts as, while you have these separate arts, they're not necessarily outside of the trivium. They kind of work together in the way that they're organized. Grammar would have been about the basic building blocks of the language, but rhetoric and dialectic really ran together in a lot of ways, because you needed the art of dialectic, to at least to some degree, to begin creating the basic your basic arguments. It's discovering of arguments through the art of dialectic, which you needed in rhetoric. And then you also needed a process by which you organize that into a completed speech, let's say. So, rhetoric and dialectic would run interspersed. And even as you would read treatises in the quadrivium to tease out different things, you might read the same treatise to get an understanding of music, arithmetic, and geometry. So a treatise isn't about a subject. A treatise is about processes that are part of the broader notion. So Ramus decides, following in the footsteps of other Renaissance reformers, that teaching is too complicated, and that you need to give to rhetoric what belongs to rhetoric, and give to the art of dialectic which belongs to the art of dialectic. And he begins separating out those tenets, and he develops this dialectic of the arts so that, each unto its own, for the purpose of teaching, recognizing that as you apply it, you can apply everything. Ramus has there's a nice description of an art. So, that an art imitates, the arts imitates and strengthens nature. Okay. So one of the things when we see the word arts, what we really should be thinking about is the concept of the artificial. Okay. Because it was understood that the artificial would then take a tree, which has no use other than to sit under. Realize today we would make other arguments about that. But we would take that tree and turn it into something useful. Okay. Whether it's shingles for a roof or the boards for a house, the materials you needed to build a trebuchet or a catapult. So it just depends on your perspective. But that was artificial, took the natural world and made it useful for the use of man. And this sense of usefulness, which, you know, we can go back to Plutarch a little bit. He talks about that in the threefold tool. I mean, this is an application in many ways of the threefold tool of education through this process. We can also understand this in terms of language, to make language useful. So you would learn logic, the art of dialectic, to help you become a better speaker, to argue better, to reason better, because as you're not, because you might be reading text, but you're also reading the natural world, because you really have, for some time through the Middle Ages, people are, scholars are studying the natural world, a la Aristotle and the Greeks. And so this is all part of that processes of living life as an educated person. Okay. So as Ramus develops his art of dialectic, we see the beginnings of curriculum as a orderly pedagogical presentation of an art or science. There's really no distinction between art and science. They really are applied in similar ways. So an art that is completed is a science because it's a science because it can be taught. This goes back to Aristotle. So it's a set body of knowledge. Okay, but you see how as pedagogies begin to change, as we begin to change how we understand the world, we get new interests, the rise of the content disciplines as they are, through this kind of dialectic of the arts. So Ramus, what Ramus does, what he's really famous for, is he reforms the art of dialectic, which had begun under Agricola. Now the art of dialectic has two parts. You have dialectical invention and dialectical judgment. So dialectical invention is basically the process of analysis in which you're finding your arguments. Okay, you have a topic you want to argue, and so you use dialectical invention as part of the art of dialectic to tease out those things you want to say. The art of dialectical judgment is then the process of putting that together into a coherent body of work, into a speech. Later into 30 years or so beyond Ramus, into a composition. As we move away from an oral society towards a literate society. Method, so Ramus invents method. So in his final, so he's constantly playing with the art of dialectic. And if we were sitting in classroom, and I probably could have brought it, I have a copy, one of the later copies of Ramus's Art of Dialectic. It's clearly a reprint. It's not original, but it's an old reprint, and it's in Old English. It's rather difficult to read, so it's an English version, which might have been published before he died. I can't remember. He did, obviously, Ramus never wrote in English. He generally wrote in Latin, although he did write a French version of the Art of Dialect, which I have not seen. I've seen the Latin. But he constantly played with it. And then one of the areas that he played with the most was dialectical judgment. And out of his is playing with that emerges the very concept of method. Now, method prior to this, while it existed in the Greek, it was not seen as necessarily an important concept. It was usually attributed to things like a ruse, or the way somebody would develop a ruse to fool you, or it was related to medicine, because the physician needed some way to prove or to demonstrate that it was his cures and not nature that cured the patient. And so method was a part of that device of stringing together evidence in a very particular way. So Ramus develops first this idea of natural teaching or natural dialectic, which he basically argues is the natural way of teaching is deductive, where you begin with a broad category and provide evidence through your teaching as you go, going from the most general to the less general, finally to the most specific through that process. So it's a deductive process. Then he develops this idea of a cryptic method. And the cryptic method, he argued, was what you use for recalcitrant students, what you use for students that aren't ready to learn. Okay, I'm sure most of you have had students like that. And so cryptic method does nothing more than reverses the order. It's an inductive process where you begin with very specific examples to try to interest the student, sort of like Piaget talks about things like that. And then you build upon that to a more general understanding for the student. So the student can learn the general from the specific, but you do all this in a step-by-step process. Eventually, he kind of discards the notion of natural and cryptic, and he talks about method as a single ladder that one can move up and down. Okay, so method then becomes an inductive deductive process based upon the way you want to move as a teacher, based upon your students. And so he kind of brings all that together. But teaching method, as we understand it today, is something that you would argue that Ramus invented out of dialectical judgment, and would begin to, over the next, I would say, 30 years after his death, so the next generation or so, begin to dominate not so much the university, although it kind of stayed around, but particularly in the earlier schools. So schoolmasters, as the modern idea of school begins to emerge, particularly in Germany, but to some degree in England. But for the British, the Oxford and Cambridge, Oxford was never a place where Ramism kind of developed to any great extent, but Cambridge it clearly was. So Emmanuel College would become later the College of Ramism, because that's the college that had become to be dominated by the Puritans at Cambridge. All of the early divines that would form the College of Harvard in New England, in Boston, all came from Emmanuel College, including Thomas Shepard, one of the more famous preachers of that period, who I thought I might have been related to, but I'm not. So because one of my grandfather's name was Thomas Shepard. So I am related to Connecticut Yankees, though. So anyway, any questions at this point? Okay, following along. So it can be argued that Ramus develops 3 principles of method. So one of the authors in the paper, in the article, talks about this, but these look fairly familiar. Number 1, teaching practice is divided into invention and judgment. So think about, if you were developing your own class, your own lesson plans, you would have to do research to figure out what you wanted to teach. And then you had to put it together in a particular way. We still engage in dialectical judgment when we write a lesson plan. We call it, we talk about it in terms of method, but we're organizing a discourse. And that's what dialectic is meant to do, is help you organize a discourse. So think about it as the logical arrangement of a subject in order to teach it. That is the first principle. The second principle is that teaching, or your dialectic or teaching method, must not argue about its own principles. So when was the last time you had a faculty meeting in which we actually argued about curriculum? You usually are handed something and said, this is the curriculum, a set of standards, maybe even a script, different, you're handed, I'd say earlier we would be handed a textbook. So your curriculum is largely your textbook coming out of that. And that has another Ramus connection. But, and so you don't argue about your principles. That occurs even, we don't argue about accreditation at the university, for instance. But largely accreditation is about the curriculum. It's a curriculum process. And finally, what is taught must be useful. Okay. And so, we're constantly told, to provide relevant, useful examples. And so why? I mean, what's the purpose of usefulness? And I think largely we want to give our students knowledge so they can use that knowledge to improve their lives, to live their better life, okay, to improve the kinds of people they are. And if we don't do that, then the question is, why do we have compulsory education if we can't achieve those ends? That's a rhetorical question, something to think about. So out of all this, Ramus invents curriculum. Cicero is the model for a curriculum. It's his academic life, and I have a chart in the article. It's kind of blurry. It's in Latin, but you can find the word curriculum. I also one of the things I did in researching this, we knew that map was not created by Ramus. It was created by a German by the name of Johann Fregius, several years after his death. But it came from a group of lectures called the Professio Regio lectures. I finally got a copy of those lectures. They were in Latin, and I delved through them as best I could, not knowing Latin. But I discovered where Ramus actually uses the term curriculum. And he's talking about Cicero's academic career. So that becomes the first, if you will, the first notion of curriculum, a way of organizing a set of knowledge for a learned, to become a learned person, an educated person. That now, the word curriculum doesn't take off as a, in the general discourse at that point. It takes some time. And it kind of really emerges. And I think if you go to Oxford's etymology of the word, Oxford Dictionary's etymology of the word, they'll attribute it to Scottish universities. A guy named Melville, he was a student of Ramus's at Cambridge, went up to Edinburgh and founded, or Glasgow maybe, and founded the university. And it was a thoroughly Ramus university, as was Trinity in Dublin, founded by a guy named Temple. So these were the two earliest universities built upon Ramus principles. You would then get Harvard, because the Puritans adopted Ramus as a kind of patron saint. They saw his learning as a way to better access an understanding of God's meaning for you in life. You'll see some of that in the Puritan paper. The word prior to curriculum, which of course in Latin means racetrack, was just the use of the Latin word cursus or course. And so you do get it, as you read it, you do get a different sense of the use of cursus over curriculum, because we know curriculum is kind of self-repeating process of a racetrack, whereas cursus kind of suggests the coursing of a stream. Sort of has a more existential feeling of it. So you coursing the course of a path. This notion of journey, education is a kind of journey where you don't, the point of the journey is to be educated. It's not the point of the journey to gain a skill to make money. It's a much older notion. Finally, Ramism influences the rise of the modern world. We talked about its influence in the Puritans. More of that will come. It certainly, most of the early, in fact, all of the early theses for graduating Harvard, for instance, and Yale as well, all were Ramus papers, and they use the word technometry, which is a takeoff on technologia. Okay, and again, we'll get introduced to some of that in the next paper. You also have Comenius, who was a Bohemian scholar and teacher. He's important because he is the person that invented, if you will, the graded classroom. So first grade, second grade, third grade. He is one of those late, really early modern educational reformers. And it's because of Comenius that we have schools organized in the way that we have them. He does, I believe he dies in London. He becomes a kind of a man without a country. He belonged to the Moravian Brotherhood, which founded Calvin, and they were one of the losers of the 30 Years' War, which was roughly a war won by both the Lutherans and the Catholics. So the Calvinists kind of lost that on the continent. And he was highly nationalistic, did some of the earliest works in Bohemian. Has a book he wrote called The Labyrinth, which is in a lot of ways a Ramus exercise. And you also see, talk about the influences of Ramus on both Francis Bacon as he develops his new learning and really envelops what we come to understand experimental science. So at this time, science, part of that wasn't experimental in the same way. We kind of taught what we knew. And of course, Rene Descartes. And then later, a book called, a little bit later than Descartes, a book called The Art of Logic by Ornard and Nicole. One's a French priest, the other's a French bureaucrat. And they developed this book called The Art of Logic, which begins as a Ramus text, but then moves well beyond that. So Ramism, and so even today, if you teach the essay writing process, you're teaching Ramus's method. Okay. So that's fundamentally what his process is.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing, Doc, because I can remember when I was in high school, especially, maybe not necessarily in college, or at least in high school, I can remember having to chart, different things in the preparatory process to being able to write an essay.
Right. Well, you can think of dialectical judgment as a process by which you arrange and rearrange note cards before you begin the writing process, and this was prior to my understanding of who Ramus was. When I wrote my master's thesis, and I think I still have the box somewhere, I don't think I've ever threw it out, filled with my note cards from our Russian history thesis. And I remember spending hours arranging and organizing those note cards until I finally got everything aligned, and then I began to write. I did not write my dissertation that way. I did write my thesis that way. Both took about 4 years for different reasons, but I was certainly much more organized for my master's thesis. But of course, I think in some ways I knew that subject matter a lot better. But anyway, so that's what I got. Hopefully that will help you as you read. If you haven't read it, hopefully maybe that explains some things. If you have any questions, any other questions?
I had a comment because
Yeah.
I wrote about Ramus in my dissertation too, but very, very briefly, I think I mentioned him like 10 times or so, but I thought it was just interesting. So I study rhetoric, and
Right.
he's not really he's not viewed in a super positive light by people who are rhetoricians today, because rhetoric consists of different parts. So there's invention, which is coming up with the argument, arrangement, how you arrange your argument, style, which obviously is how you deliver it. Delivery is your gestures and your stuff, and then
Right.
memory is just remembering what you're going to say because it was spoken originally. And so Ramus, he made the argument that, I guess with the law of justice, that invention, arrangement, and memory are all things that people do even if they aren't able to speak, right? You can do that internally. So
Right.
he said, therefore, it's not actually a part of rhetoric, it's a part of dialectic.
Yes.
And rhetoric should only be concerned with style and delivery.
Yeah.
And whereas before, speaking and writing were seen really as generative and this really complex mental process, I think a lot of people following that for a long time saw rhetoric as this very shallow kind of stylistic exercise. And so I just thought it was an interesting context that how he kind of changed the role of rhetoric in a way, and like historians of rhetoric aren't really a huge fan of what he did in that sense.
No, I knew that and I understood it.
Yeah.
But I mean, as I understand it, he largely organized it that way for the purpose of teaching.
Yeah.
So, because if you read you're in my 503 class, Harry? No.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, I think you will be. So you get, I have them read a paper I wrote on Gabriel Harvey, an English arts master, very interesting fellow. But they read a commencement lecture that he gave over 2 days called The Rhetor, about rhetoric. And and so it's kind of applying these notions about what makes a good rhetorician. And you see Ramus ideas all through that, because he was a follower of Ramus. But it's not divided in quite the way that Ramus would have divided it, in the way that but he comes out of but he organizes the speech, the lecture, along the threefold tool of education: art, nature, and exercise practice. So I understand where you're coming from. I was going to say something else.
But so you're saying that like basically it's not he was trying to separate them in practice necessarily, but just separating them for the ease of teaching.
Correct. That's the way
I think that maybe later adopters kind of took it a little far in like 19th century composition classrooms and stuff like that. But I can see how he was looking at more just a technique rather than like something actually done in practice. That's interesting.
His whole idea was to make instruction as simple as possible. Now, what I was going to say is that while he was banned from the university, a book came out by a guy named Omar on a new art of rhetoric. And Omar was a student of Ramus's. So it's argued in some places that really Omar didn't write it. It was Ramus that wrote it. But he was at that point banned from any type of academic activity because of his Ramus. I mean, because of his attacks on Aristotle, particularly at the time. And it was really the king that came to his rescue and named him a professor, a royal professor, and sort of rehabilitated him for a while before he got killed in the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. Now, what's interesting is during his period of exile from the university, he actually was the first person to make money selling textbooks. So he was pretty tight with the printers that had developed in the Rhineland. They're not that far away. And he would travel there with texts, and then they would print and sell, and he would make money off of that. So that's how he kind of, financed his activities. In the textbook, so his arts of dialectic and the arts of rhetoric are understood to be really some of the first textbooks by the way they were organized. So the textbook follows that pattern over time. So, very interesting. Anybody else?
Yeah, Doc, I got a quick question. It's basically on page 49. I don't know if you have the text right in front of you. And I'll just kind of quote it off, and it's constructed just around a question. Here it states, Ramus insisted that no form of knowledge, whether derived from a text or a student's own mental possessions, should be accessible to the student until it had first passed through the pedagogical method. My question is directed towards that quote. Is this a kind of form of educational censorship that he's advocating for?
I don't think it's educational censorship as much as until it goes through that pedagogical process, it's not going to be well organized and well thought
Okay.
through. So it won't be intellectualized. Okay. It kind of,
Right.
it is kind of foreign from the way I think we think today. Some of that may be unfortunate.
Right.
Because I see it as the student has to learn how to stop and think about what he's about ready to say. So again, it's more of this privileging the artificial, because Ramus speaks a lot about what he would call natural dialectic. So, and I think that's part of what Eric was talking about. So that we have these natural abilities to speak and to make judgments about the world. I argue that if you watch a toddler that you put on the floor for the first time, or put them on grass in the yard, and they begin to discover that world, they're picking up things, they're tasting things, they're making maybe baby talk about things they see. And through that process, they're making judgments about the world.
Mm.
Okay. That is it's a kind of deduction, sort of immediate deduction.
Right.
That's kind of a natural dialectic. One of the greatest medieval orators is probably Bernard of Clairvaux, and as far as I know, he never had one class in rhetoric. He was a natural speaker.
Right.
Okay. So he had a fairly well formed natural dialectic that was very effective. Got a lot of knights to take up arms and go get killed in a holy battle. So,
Thank you.
all right.
So what do we have? What are the due dates that are coming up? We have the gloss for Ramus due, or the quest for method due on Thursday. Is that right? And is there anything
Yeah.
else due this week?
I don't think anything else is due. Let me pull let's see if I got my complete schedule here. So,
Oh, you know what? Sorry, I meant to ask you about one of the Kleebard assignments, and the syllabus, it says that there's like short essays for the Kleebard, but I didn't really see the details
the
for those
essays,
assignments or the due dates.
well, the due date is like the 25th.
Okay.
And I may need to send those out, but if you go to your portfolio and you click on the assignment, it should be, the essay should come up in the description.
Okay.
And if you don't see that, let me know and I'll stick them on Moodle. I probably should do that anyway. And I just want, put them all in a single document.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I must have just missed that somehow. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So yeah, why am I in August already? Oh, I see what I'm doing.
Okay, I do see the Kleebard on portfolio. Okay, sorry about that. I just missed it.
So yeah, Questford method is due on the 11th. We should be in, no, that's the other class. So your difficulty draft is due on the 17th,
Okay.
and your gloss on the Puritan origins of technological understanding is also due on the 17th.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I give you the moral no, that's the other class. I was confused. So I return the difficulty draft to you by the 22nd. And then the final, your final draft and the essays for Clebar to do on the 25th.
Okay. And the moral life of schools assignment is due on the 20th. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. That is, yes.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, then I'm all straight. Sorry about my confusion, and I'm sorry if others were already on the right track, and I just needed personal clarification, but thanks.
Well, so you can admit you're confused. I can't. So anyway, so the June sessions are very hectic. So, all
I
right.
have a question
Yes.
about More Life of Schools. Just how long do you want it and what format? 12-point double spaced?
Yeah, that's fine.
And how many pages, or as many as we need?
Yeah, I'd say as many as you need.
Any minimum, or just
No,
okay?
I mean, some people might be able to respond to that in 2. Some people may take 3. I have no doubt somebody will write 5.
Okay.
And that's all. And that's all fine. Yeah. If you haven't been an active teacher, so there are people in higher ed in this class, chances are you won't have as much to say. And if you haven't been in the classroom for any length of time, if you're just out of student teaching, you may have less to say than somebody say has been teaching for 5 years around that. And so, because I mean, what we're going to try to do without getting to observe is think about ourselves, and that's using the categories in the text. Great question, Julie. Thank you. I can stop the sharing. There you go. Anyone else? Okay, good. So I wasn't planning on doing a live video on the third reading, but if you think I should, let me know. Okay. So y'all have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it.
Thank you.